What's up? Can you guys hear me? Yeah, all right. I live here, so this was a short jaunt for me this morning after dropping off the kid. So I'm excited to give this talk because it is an interesting time to look at this stuff right now, mostly because I think a lot of you maybe have came from Masari mainnet. I was out there too at New York. There was this other little thing going on called Climate Week at the same time as Masari. So for people like me, it's a ton of events going from one to the other. And so today I'm going to walk you through what I think the opportunity is for us who are building in Web3 to go after this market, which I think is the biggest market in history. And I'll kind of show you why I think so. A little bit about me, real quick. So I started a fund 2 years ago. It's focused on nature and energy markets, really digital climate infrastructure is what you can think of it as. We've been like however many years in the software evolution, but we still lack really basic stuff around the energy grid, energy data, green electron production, knowing like what is the mix of brown versus green in the energy grid, so we can actually say how much do we decarbonize a thing. So really our fund is focused on decarbonization by looking at financing nature and understanding renewable energy in the grid. And so I also run a podcast called The Ownership Economy. A couple of builders from Chainlink have been on it, the founders of Gitcoin, some Ethereum, Aave people, all that. Check it out. That's displaying weirdly. Anyway, don't worry about that. Let's get into it. So first, I'm not going to get into too much of this, but basically, over the last 70, 100 years, we've been facing a biodiversity crisis, planet's heating up. There are various theories as to why. I'm not going to get into any of that today, but the thing I want to point out is that whether or not you believe in climate change, we have lost a ton of biodiversity. Something like 85% of the world's biomass is us and the animals we eat and raise, right? So it's probably a problem, but we'll see. We also have a huge sort of finance gap. So basically, if you look at some of the things we need to do to address the stuff on the previous slide, some of the estimates have us hitting, something like $6 trillion in annual global investment to address those things through things like digital sustainable bonds, philanthropy, restoration projects, protection projects, and I'll get into the sustainable bond stuff because there's a clear Chainlink use case. Good news is, though, we are actually, if you zoom in on that little area we were looking at earlier, that thing ends at 2021, we are rapidly addressing this climate finance thing. We hit $1 trillion in climate finance last year. That involves things like nature-based solutions, direct air capture projects, new chemistries, new biology, all that kind of stuff. However, it's really hard for us to actually zoom in and say, what did we direct that at? The proof. Like, what did we actually do with it? What did that ecology do? Can we actually make remote monitoring and AI-based measurements of an ecosystem and say, we did a thing, we achieved a goal? It's very difficult to do that. And I would contend it's mostly because we treat nature like this thing we can just continue extracting from. So, we haven't really rationalized how nature makes sense to the financial system. We just go like, well, we have GDP, we have the economy, and we get some free stuff, like clean air, clean water, ecosystems, all that kind of stuff. And we have no real incentive to dig deeper on that. So to give you an example of what I mean by making nature make sense to the financial system, these are the numbers for the global food system, right? So the global food system's value is about $10 trillion. However, if you break down its environmental costs, it's actually in the red through things like pollution, pesticides, food waste. You roll all that stuff up, it's about $12 trillion in costs every year to run the global food system, right? It's not one system, of course. It's very complex. It's distributed. But just to give you an idea, like if we were to say, what's going on there and can we actually address those, that's the kind of challenge we're looking at. But that's not because nature is worthless, right? I just want to point out a couple big numbers on this slide. First, you have something like, if you actually did break down the inputs from nature and say, what do we get on the output of GDP for the inputs we get? Ecosystem services is the term economists use for this, and it's worth about $33 trillion a year. And if you kind of zoom in a bit more on that, and let's look at, if you think back to that $10 trillion slide with the food system, you zoom in on the annual value of traded goods there, and it's about $10 trillion, right? So if we actually sat down there and broke that down, most of that comes from products, which are just things we grow and extract and sell on market. If you zoom in, a paltry, tiny, less than 1%, which is actually a sliver within that sliver, it is actually tied to conserving and regenerating nature so that we can actually pay it forward. But governments are starting to notice this stuff, and this is kind of where we begin to come in, right? So 2 months ago, the EU passed a law that said all member nations must restore 20% of their wetlands, peatlands by 2030, and they must achieve 50% of that restoration by 2050. When I was at Climate Week, we went to the NYSE for the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a mouthful, TNFD. And I'll break down all the acronyms if you're curious afterwards. There's a lot of them. But TNFD basically released a 14-point protocol that helps banks, companies, and financial institutions understand their nature risk, right? So if you think back to that food system thing, if you're Nestle, if you're Barry Callebaut, world's largest chocolatier, if you apply for a debt facility with a bank, that bank is now going to ask you, hey, if we pay you $1 billion to bring products to market, we give you a debt facility, what's the risk of that debt going into default? And do you understand what you're doing to the ecosystems you operate in, right? Like, are you going to be able to pay that back, right? This has now become a risk problem, a risk management problem. And TNFD builds on TCFD, which is the climate-based version of this. 3,800 member organizations have joined it since 2017, and it's getting adoption across the US and Europe. I was also at ICE, where one of our portfolio companies, Meridia, basically announced that they're going to help the world's largest commodities exchange trace all commodities and whether they resulted in deforestation within the EU. Because in December 2024, you're actually not going to be able to trade the top 7 commodities within the EU if you can't prove that they didn't result in deforestation. It's a 4% of revenue fine, and it's an $80 billion trading volume, right, for those 7 commodities, which I always miss one, but it's chocolate, cocoa, wood, rubber, soy, corn, and I forget the 7th one. But anyway, those will now be regulated in December 2024. And so you're also now seeing, a lot, I get this a lot because I work in, sort of climate and crypto, and people are like, well, isn't this market just, I don't know if we're allowed to cuss, nonsense, right? Isn't this just greenwashing, fraud? Yes, a lot of it is. And what's happening is that there's also laws being passed against that, right? And one of the actions people are taking because of that is they're actually not doing offsets anymore, right? So Nestle came out recently and said, we're no longer going to just destroy some biodiversity here and pay for it over here. We're going to look inside our value chain, and we're going to incentivize changes towards more regenerative outcomes, less environmental destruction. We're going to pay for those. It's called insetting. So quick recap before we get into solutions, right? What did we learn? One, the nature opportunity size is massive, right? It's like one of the biggest potential markets ever in history. Finance really understands this from the perspective of risk. It understands that if it works with these businesses in the current context, there might be some unforeseen hidden risks to the entire system. They might not get paid back, right? So they've launched things like TNFD and TNCD as reporting frameworks. They're not compliance frameworks yet. Some of those things were compliance-driven. And then lastly, you have regulation that's kind of coalescing around nature to form markets, right? So keep those in mind. What this is kind of building towards and what the language these folks are using is they want to build a nature-positive economy, right? So what does that even look like? What's in the way of that? I mentioned a couple things, right? There's greenwashing. For instance, you've got Delta Airlines coming up and saying, hey, so we're a climate-neutral airline through our purchase of offsets, which is kind of laughable. You don't have any real market liquidity, right? When we look at things like what we're trading in, you on CoinMarketCap, or you're looking at stocks, that level of liquidity for environmental asset markets is as shallow as a pond. And lastly, we have the measurement problem. Ecosystems are super complex. What do we actually do when we're looking at them? Where do we start? So one answer real quickly is really just breaking this down to 3 things. We need scientifically proven methodologies for measuring and issuing environmental assets. These exist. There's about 20 years in that game. We need tech to actually perform measurement based on that methodology or protocol and report on that measurement, which you can probably see where Chainlink is going to come in. And lastly, you need a market. You need to actually have a way to pay for those outcomes and make those outcomes tradable, right? That's what I think. And so, what does this look like right now in crypto? There's a couple of projects I'm going to walk you through that are doing this. So Regen Network is one of them that basically brings scientists, project developers, a bunch of people together to originate these methodologies in peer review, right? We're going to walk through a couple of monitoring technologies and how they could interact with Chainlink real quick at a high level. And then lastly, we'll talk about how do we get those last mile payments. So as I mentioned real quickly, if you go on Regen Network's registry today, it's a Git book. They will walk you through. There's about 7 to 10 methodologies they've done in their 3 years of existence. They've done in cooperation with scientists who are experts on some of this stuff, and they're also iterative. That's what I like about them. A lot of the stuff that's happened in these markets over the years has basically been greenwashing because a registry owns them, it doesn't update them, and it has no real incentive to actually report on them after they've issued the credits. Regen does. And then lastly, they provide, once these methodologies come together, they provide a credit class that lets you monetize based on what you've done in that ecosystem. Lets you issue a credit and monetize the protocol. Renoster is another company that actually looks at this stuff from space and from the perspective of flood and fire risk and says, hey, this tract of forest that company or protocol like Delta said they're going to protect, is it still there? Right, pretty simple question. There are other things involved, but really just, is the thing still there? And then from that, if you look at the methodology and you run the numbers, you can say, in a vacuum, how many credits was it supposed to issue? And then if we observe it, what is our correction to that baseline? And then we can actually issue the credits. And then you could look at something like the monitoring of that and say, let me package that up in a data source, make it available to a smart contract if I'm going to actually pay someone to do this, right? Because most of the people in the world who do this actually do it for free. So we're talking about like indigenous people, land stewards, people who don't even have land title, potentially, are out there just stewarding nature for free most of the time, and sometimes they get paid for it. So if you actually went through and said, imagine a data source on the left that actually is just looking at flood and fire risk and seeing if trees are still there. I know it sounds silly, but legitimately, sometimes you just have to prove that the trees are there. Right? That's where a lot of these things have been greenwashed over the years, as people said, oh yeah, no, of course, trust us. We sent a person with the clipboard out there to check on the trees, they're still there. And then you look at them from space and they're not there. Right? So you just need a way to make that data available to a smart contract and have some entity that can accept a payment on the other side of that. We have all these pieces, right? Like they're out there. So ecosystem services payments is kind of like the last piece of this, right? We talked about that big $33 trillion number. Just a little bit of info on where this stuff is today. Colombia, Brazil, and the Horn of Africa out to the west of Africa is where a lot of this stuff lives today. It's where a lot of the products that we're reliant on come from. Sugar, you probably had coffee today. You might have chocolate later. It all comes from those places. And 80% of the world's biodiversity is there sustaining it, right? And we could actually, from everything I showed you here, pay for that stuff today if we wanted to, right? So what do you really need? We kind of walked through some of this stuff. You need to have a protocol to issue an asset that represents an environmental outcome. You need a way to observe that thing. Then you need a way to kind of run an ecological state calculation. What happened there? We measured ecological state at this point. We did it again at some other point, 6 to 12 months later. What was the delta? And can we make that calculation available to a smart contract and pay people? It turns out like you can, right? Some people are actually doing this, and they're doing it with Chainlink, right? This is actually a time, like if you're a developer in the audience or you're watching this later, it's a great time to get involved in this. It's a massive market, right? And you're actually doing ostensibly good things, but you're also getting paid. You're making money too. So just to wrap that up real quick, right? Climate finance is one of the biggest like dollar sign markets you could be going after. It's massively growing. In tandem with that, regulators and reporting frameworks are forming a market around this, right? They're actually seeing this and saying, we should do something about this because we let it do its thing for 20 years and we saw a lot of fraud and greenwashing and not a lot of effective projects. So we should participate, shape the market. And then if you look at the tech that we've been building here in the last 14 years in our space, it has direct applications here, right? Measurement of state, seeing if a thing happened or not, making that available to a smart contract to automate and make things more efficient. That's all out there, right? We could be doing that today. So that's it. I'll skip that one. If you want to connect with me and chat about this, that's how to get in touch with me. And thanks for your time.